First talk of the semester. Thank you so much to George Mason's Catholic Campus Ministry for affording us this space to have our event. Just some brief words about the Thomistic Institute if you're new to us. Thomistic Institute is an academic institute of the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C. It exists to promote the truth in our contemporary world by bringing the best of the Western intellectual tradition, guided by the thinking of Thomas Aquinas, to secular universities across the country. It seeks to strengthen the intellectual formation of Christians at universities, in church, and in the wider public square. Our chapter here at George Mason hosts speakers each semester and holds a series of reading groups on works as varied as C.S. Lewis's Problem of Pain and Dante's Divine Comedy. The talk tonight will be followed by a brief Q&A, so if you're watching at home or in our live audience, be ready with some questions, and you can post those in the chat, and we'll ask them live. Just some brief words about the speaker. Father Dominic Legge is the director of the Thomistic Institute, and he's the assistant professor in dogmatic theology at the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C. He holds a JD from Yale, PhL from the School of Philosophy of the Catholic University of America. And he has a doctorate in sacred theology from the University of Freiburg in Switzerland. Little biography. He entered into the Order of Preachers in 2001 after having practiced constitutional law for several years as a trial attorney for the U.S. Department of Justice. He's taught at the Catholic University Law School and at Providence College. So join me in welcoming Father Dominic Legge.
Thanks very much, Nick. It's great to be here with you, and it's great to actually see some real faces in the audience. So I know that we're very limited as to what the live audience could be, but it's really great to be able to have at least a few of you here and have the rest, God willing, joining from home. So my talk this evening is entitled Judging the Truth, Law and Moral Relativism. Thou shalt not judge. For our contemporary culture, especially for the typical university culture, this can be seen as the first and you might say the greatest commandment. It may be, in fact, on the contemporary university, the only commandment that really has some kind of moral force. Do not judge. The great sin of our age, in the minds of many of our contemporaries, is to be judgmental. You could even perhaps describe it as a kind of capital vice for postmodernity. In the background for such a kind of attitude, a judgment about judgments, you might say, in the background behind such a judgment about judgments is an assumption or a conviction, sometimes unspoken, that moral judgments are arbitrary and subjective, and that they're not based on anything as objective as provable facts, public facts, and therefore, if they're acknowledged at all, if moral judgments are acknowledged at all, they should stay in the sphere of the private, interior, subjective convictions, that they lack public standing. So, what I'd set out before us in this talk is to address what we mean when we say that one is making a judgment. And in what sense being judgmental is a vice or a sin, and how this is related to the law and also to contemporary claims about truth, tolerance, and moral relativism. Okay, so there's a few parts here. First, we're going to talk about judgments. Then the second major part of the talk is going to be about relativism and how to think about that. So first, on judgments. If it's true that to be judgmental is a vice, if we just take for a moment that hypothesis, would that mean that every judgment we make is an act of vice? Well, even for someone who wants to avoid being judgmental, it seems that they wouldn't agree to that. They would say, well, you have to make some judgments, right? People mostly have no problem with making scientific judgments, judgments about scientific truths. So these are truths that we presumably can know as valid in all places and at all times. And so, generally speaking, what I'm aiming to address in this talk is not a kind of universal philosophical skepticism. You can find that in some places. Somebody who's like a really radical relativist who claims that we can't know any truth at all. You sometimes encounter people like that. But usually, most people that you will encounter on a contemporary university campus will accept that there are at least some scientific truths, some mathematical truths that we can know. So how would Aquinas analyze this? Or Aristotle? Actually, Aquinas follows Aristotle on this. Aquinas teaches that there are two principal acts of the mind. Now, I'm simplifying a little bit here, but this is a little brief, you might say, philosophical summary about how our mind works to know the truth. So the first act of the mind is called simple apprehension, and that is a complicated name simply to express that you grasp what a thing is. So you encounter 3 dogs, Spot, Fido, Rover, and you apprehend that all 3 of them are dogs. So you are abstracting from these 3 beings the idea of dog. So that is really in your mind, and you are able to see that you are getting that idea from these particular dogs. Then there is a second dimension to the mind's act, what the Thomist tradition calls judgment. So there's apprehension, and then there is judgment. Judgment involves joining and separating things. So in a sentence, you have a subject and a predicate. You learn that in 4th grade. And so in a sentence, you are making affirmative or negative judgments about, say, the subject of the sentence. And judgments about whether it is true, whether it corresponds to reality. So, for example, to say, this dog is angry, that requires you to know what a dog is by the first act of the mind, simple apprehension, and what being angry is. Okay, that's also an act of apprehension. And then you join those 2 notions together, judging that this dog is angry. Okay, fairly clear, but Aquinas calls that an act of judgment. More fundamentally, you can make a judgment when you say that something exists. So dogs exist, unicorns do not, at least so far as I know. So that is a judgment. Now for a Thomist, this kind of judgment is one of the fundamental aspects of being a rational person. So to live the life of reason requires you to make judgments like that. And we're not talking about something extremely highfalutin here. We're talking about recognizing reality around us. That's what our mind is made to do, made to understand it in some way. And that calls for us to make certain judgments. No science would be possible if we could not make these kinds of basic judgments. Okay, but usually people who are talking about being judgmental are not worried about what I've just described. They're not worried about making judgments like that. They think maybe something else is going on when you make what might be called a moral judgment. So let's talk about that for a minute. And let's start with the law. So as Nick mentioned in the introduction, I was a lawyer before I became a Dominican. So I've worked in courtrooms, and I've given some thought to how the law works. And I find it's a useful starting point for Americans because we love talking about the law. Actually, I can give you a little inside info here. In a Dominican priory, so like where I live, typically we do have a recreation room with a television where on occasion you can go and, we don't watch a lot of TV, but if anybody's going to watch TV, they're probably watching Law and Order. It's like the favorite TV show of most Dominicans. It's like, give me the law, right? Okay, Americans love shows like that. Okay, so what are the kinds of judgments you find in the law? Okay, in a trial, the goal of a trial in a courtroom is not just to have factual findings about what actually happened, and then legal conclusions about what the law says about this or that subject, but actually to combine these two things in what is technically called a judgment, a final judgment. That is a resolution of the matter as a whole, where you ascertain what actually happened and you apply the law to what you have determined actually happened. So it's what a judge issues at the end of a trial. He issues a judgment, or she issues a judgment, and then an order of what must happen as a result of that judgment. And we could actually also talk about the law more generally, making judgments. So sometimes people will speak this way. The law judges this, the law judges that. Certainly, if you are a lawmaker, if you're a member of Congress, for example, and you are formulating laws, you're writing laws, a lawmaker inevitably is making a judgment about things, about what is good for our community, about what is bad for our community, in order to order the life of our community. So, okay, some people, their minds will immediately go to what our culture would consider to be like typical moral judgments. So usually when you talk about using morality in the law, people imagine a preacher with a Bible thumping you over the head with it, right? You know, like pounding into you certain precepts about sexual morality. That's usually what people immediately think you're talking about. But actually, every law is making a judgment, and I would contend is making a moral judgment. So let's take a very neutral example. Think about environmental regulations. So you have regulations about how much carbon emissions we should tolerate this year in the United States, or as emitted by a particular industry. Now, you might be tempted to think that this is a judgment justified by purely factual or scientific statements. Statements like high carbon emissions decrease air quality. You could just say, okay, that's a factual statement. But notice that within a statement like that, there is a judgment about what you should or should not do. So, if you were to lay out the justification for a law restricting carbon emissions, you would say something like this. Well, a healthy environment is a part of the common good, avoiding global warming, having good air quality, etc. You could list the various features of what we would consider to be a healthy environment. And the community as a whole should take responsibility for this good. And certain actions or activities harm the environment. They harm that good, and therefore they should not be done. So the law should try to discourage those acts or even punish them. And other activities are helpful to the environment, and those are things that we should do and that we should encourage. Okay, in fact, that has the same structure, you might say, as a typical moral judgment, certainly seen from the perspective of St. Thomas Aquinas. And in fact, I would suggest that we do make moral judgments about polluters. So, you're sort of a bad company if you're polluting a lot. You're not being a good steward of the environment. If you don't recycle, you can feel bad about it. This actually, now this is going back a ways. When I first went to law school, I had been going to college in California, where there was pretty aggressive push for environmental responsibility and recycling. So every dorm room came equipped with a recycle bin as well as a trash bin, and it just became so ingrained that you would put leftover paper in the recycle bin, you would put aluminum cans in the recycle bin. You would not think of putting those in the trash. So after 4 years of living that way, I then went off to law school on the East Coast. I went to Yale for law school, and there in the dormitories, there was no recycling bin. So I'm saving up my crushed aluminum cans and looking for the bin to put them in. But there was no bin in the dormitory. I mean, they had no recycling program. And I felt, so that meant I had to throw them in the trash, and I felt so guilty. I felt like I needed to go to confession for doing that. It just seemed like a really irresponsible thing to do. And that's because we do have a kind of moral sense about, for example, being a good steward of the goods entrusted to us, like the good of the environment. And that is, in fact, a moral judgment. Now, the fact that we're making moral judgments becomes even more clear when you look at the criminal law, to stay with the law for a minute. Certain actions are not only forbidden by the criminal law, but they are punished, right? So the law just doesn't tell you to recycle. The criminal law tells you if you do this act, we will punish you. We might fine you. We might even put you in prison. Sometimes you will be punished quite severely, and this is a personal punishment, right? It is not just a neutral penalty, but you yourself will have to really bear the penalty. And that implies a judgment about the action. So the criminal law, for example, says you must not kill another person, and if you do, you will be severely punished. Why? Is the only justification for that to prevent murderers from killing in the future? Well, that certainly is part of the reason why we punish murder. We try to deter future murders. But we also punish people who we know will not do it again. And we think that that's an important function of the law, to bring someone to justice for their past actions. So if we discover that a 90-year-old committed a murder 10 years earlier when he was a little more mobile, and now he's, perhaps he's suffered a stroke and he's in a wheelchair or even confined to a bed, we know he's not capable of doing it again. The law will still bring him to justice and issue a judgment about him, even if the judge, say, commutes the sentence and says you don't actually have to go to prison. But we would regard it as right for the legal system to judge that person because of the act in the past. That's because we're not just trying to prevent future wrongs. We actually think it's important to make a judgment about wrong actions. And the law is set up for that. In fact, I would suggest to you that it is very hard to come up with an example of a law that does not make a judgment. Most laws contain implicit judgments, even if they're framed in ways that maybe don't immediately suggest it. And that is, the laws are suggesting that some goods are to be done, or some things are good and therefore to be protected or done, and other things are bad and therefore to be avoided. And that's the essence, according to Aquinas, of a moral judgment. So this can be hard to see in American culture because we don't usually put it this way. But in fact, this is what morality is all about. What should be done and what should not be done. Americans in particular regard the law as a moral teacher. That's a kind of, I don't want to say totally unique aspect of our culture, because you do find it in some other places, but it's a prominent aspect of our culture vis-a-vis other cultures. So we tend to think that if the law permits something, it is also morally acceptable. And you can think about that vis-a-vis some of the hot-button issues that the Supreme Court has decided. People will generally say, or will think about it as, well, Supreme Court says that you can do this, therefore it's morally acceptable to do it. The law permits you to use marijuana, and therefore it's morally acceptable to do that. People will very quickly make that judgment. So this leads me to what I might say is a capital point, the kind of conclusion of this introductory section about what are judgments. For Thomas Aquinas, who is, I think, the great philosopher and theologian of the Catholic tradition, certainly of the Middle Ages, and our patron at the Thomistic Institute, for Thomas Aquinas, there is not a big difference, there is not a radical difference between the kind of act your mind makes when you judge that something exists, Fido is a dog, or Fido exists, and when we judge what is good for that being. And that means that in a certain way, grasping reality will lead us to moral judgments. So, Goldie the goldfish exists. Goldie the goldfish is alive. Goldie the goldfish is gold. These are all just factual statements, right? And that leads us to what we judge to be good for Goldie as a living goldfish. It is bad to flush Goldie down the toilet, right? That's not a hard judgment to make. And in fact, it's a judgment about reality, which is also a moral judgment. So the conclusion then is it's normal and in fact inevitable that we will judge some things to be good and other things to be bad. It's a part of the structure of the human mind as it has access to reality. And fundamentally, a moral judgment is about what is good and therefore should be done or sought, and what is evil and therefore what should be avoided or not done. Okay, at this point, normally somebody who is uncomfortable with strong versions of moral judgments might pose an objection. And the objection is, gosh, that sounds awfully judgy, awfully judgmental. You're judging, say, the heart of your neighbor, aren't you? Aren't you not supposed to do that? On this point, I think St. Thomas offers us some real help, because he offers an account of a vice that we could label with the modern label of being judgmental, although I'd want to add some caveats. Aquinas' vice, what Aquinas talks about, is called rash judgment. Okay, so Aquinas teaches that as human beings, we can judge things in the world around us, and our minds are made for that. But, he adds, we can only judge what we can see or perceive. We should not presume to judge what we cannot see. So we can judge the exterior act that someone engages in. We cannot see the interior movements of the heart of our neighbor. Okay, so here's a quotation from Aquinas. Man sees what appears, but the Lord beholds the heart. For to God alone is reserved the judgment of hidden things, among which especially are counted the thoughts of the heart. And hence, if anyone would presume to judge of these things, it is a rash judgment. Okay, so what is the principle there? Instead of judging our neighbor's intentions harshly, judging them in the worst light, we should presume the best about the intentions of the heart. So Aquinas thinks that it's part of the Christian virtue of charity, and also just of benevolence, being friendly to people around you, that we should love our neighbors, we should presume the best of our neighbors, we should desire the good of our neighbors, and ultimately the salvation of our neighbors, which probably means, since all of us are sinners, the repentance of our neighbors. This is Lent for us as Catholics. It's a time when we take more seriously the call to repentance. That means examining my own conscience and admitting that I am a sinner. I stand in need of God's mercy. I am not justified of myself before God, and neither is anybody else. So actually, that's a very good position to be in, and Jesus certainly gives us, often teaches about this interior attitude. Say the sinner who goes up to the temple and lays face down and says, "Have mercy on me, Lord, a sinner." And that man is justified as compared to the supposedly righteous Pharisee who simply says to God, "I'm so glad I'm not like these other sinners." Okay, so there's something profoundly Christian about this attitude of not making rash judgments about the interior heart of another person. Okay, so there are two important Thomistic distinctions then about making judgments. First, When we speak the truth about sinful actions, we are primarily judging actions. Those are things that we can observe and assess. That's not the same as judging persons. To judge a person implies making a judgment about the interior movements of the heart. And that is, properly speaking, God's domain, not ours, at least insofar as we are private persons. Now here, we should add a caveat that being a judge in a criminal case, for example, does require making a judgment that punishes a person for an action and can perhaps inquire into the intention of the person doing that. But in any case, for us as private persons, that's not my job to judge someone's intentions or the interior movements of the heart. If we presume to judge those interior movements without a sufficient reason, Aquinas would call it a rash judgment, which could be a sin. Okay, the second distinction is closely related to the first one, which I've just given you. That is between, on the one hand, the objective goodness or evil of an action, its objective rightness or wrongness, you could say, and on the other hand, the subjective moral culpability or guilt of the person who does the action. So the subjective guilt of the actor. So we should always maintain that actions can be objectively right or wrong, and that actions produce a good or evil. But that even with that, there may be little or no fault on the part of the actor, depending on how the action came about. So there could be circumstances where someone does something that objectively is wrong, and we can judge that act as wrong, but they did not have much or any guilt for that action because of how that action came about or why they did it. So there's a rather amusing anecdote to illustrate this point, which is a point that perhaps you're already kind of on board with, but this anecdote, I think, is a good illustration. Have you heard of Douglas Adams? He was the novelist who wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So, you know, he's not a religious man as far as I can tell. I think that book is a rather skeptical book, but he's a pretty humorous writer. So I'm not really recommending his philosophy, but some of his stuff is funny. So he tells the following anecdote, which he wrote in a book, a kind of memoir sort of book. He was supposed to be taking a train somewhere, and he made a mistake about the time his train was departing. So he was at the train station and had a whole bunch of time to kill. So to pass the time, he bought a newspaper and a cup of coffee and a packet of cookies, and he sat down at a table. So then here is what he wrote about the episode. He wrote, "I want you to picture the scene. Here's the table, the newspaper, the cup of coffee, the packet of cookies. There's a guy sitting opposite me. Perfectly ordinary looking guy, wearing a business suit, carrying a briefcase. It didn't look like he was going to do anything weird. What he did was this. He suddenly leaned across, picked up the packet of cookies, tore it open, took one out, and ate it. And I did what any red-blooded Englishman would do. I ignored it. I stared at the newspaper, took a sip of coffee, and thought, what am I going to do? In the end, I thought, nothing for it, I'll just have to go for it. And I tried very hard not to notice that the packet was already mysteriously opened. I took out a cookie for myself. I thought, that settled him. But it hadn't, because a moment or two later, he did it again. He took another cookie. And we went through the whole packet like this. He took one, I took one, he took one, I took one. Finally, when we got to the end, he stood up and walked away. Well, we exchanged meaningful looks, and then he walked away. And I breathed a sigh of relief and sat back. A moment or two later, the train was coming in, so I tossed back the rest of my coffee, stood up, picked up my newspaper, and underneath the newspaper were my cookies. Okay, there were in fact 2 packets of cookies. Objectively speaking, Adams stole the cookies of the other man. Now, if you live in a Dominican priory, stealing another man's cookies could be a very grave offense. I can tell you that. Especially if they're the right kind of cookies, which come around rather infrequently for us. But what did the other man think about Adams' act? The other man thought that what Adams was doing was absolutely outrageous, right? It looked to him, for all the world, like a brazen, open, intentional act of theft. Like in-your-face theft. And of course, that's what Adams thought the other man was doing. Was Adams guilty of theft? Well, he wasn't. Because he did not realize that he was taking the other man's cookies. Now, we have to say, in justice, Adams owes this anonymous man half a packet of cookies. The cookies that he ate. So the objective evil of the act that he performed is not erased by the fact that Adams was not subjectively intending to steal. Right? Do you see this distinction? It's a very important distinction. Because often people will say, oh, well, he didn't intend to do an act of theft, therefore it wasn't wrong for him to do it. But that is not the right conclusion. What we want to say is the act was wrong, objectively speaking. So he shouldn't have taken the other man's cookies. And in justice, he owes those cookies back to that man. But he's not guilty of theft because he didn't intend to commit a theft. So it's not morally culpable to have eaten the cookies, even though it was objectively wrong. Okay, the Catholic moral tradition would further distinguish at this point between ignorance or error about a fact, like I made a mistake about whether these particular cookies belong to me, and an error about the law itself. Like if you were to say, I didn't know stealing was wrong. Like I knew they were his cookies, but I didn't know it was wrong for me to take them. Because they are so basic, the Catholic tradition holds that no one can plead ignorance of the fundamental precepts of the moral law. Things like that murder is wrong, that adultery is wrong, that theft is wrong, that lying is wrong, and so forth. So in other words, everyone is held to observe the 10 Commandments. But there could be some circumstances where, for example, it's a complicated environmental law, and you don't realize that it's against the law to do that, even though you fully knew what you were doing. You know, I didn't know that I was obliged to recycle my aluminum cans, and so I did that. So I knew what I was doing. I wasn't making a mistake, but I didn't know what the law told me. So there could be ignorance in that case of the law might excuse the act. Okay, now we've come to the second part of the talk, and that's to go beyond an assessment of making judgments to moving into the claim or assessing the claim that there just are no moral truths out there, or that actions cannot be morally wrong in themselves. And that requires us to talk about relativism. So relativism comes in several different varieties, and most of them can be found on contemporary college campuses. Like if you go out into the wild to the college campuses, you can identify these different species. They're not good little animals running out there. They're sometimes they're morally dangerous. But let's see if we can name them and divide them up. Okay, there is a standard form of what is called cultural relativism, which you've probably heard people espouse. It goes something like this: right and wrong depends on what the dominant culture says. Or it depends on what you are conditioned to believe by social, religious, and cultural forces. Okay, the claim there is no standard of right and wrong that transcends your culture. It's relative to the culture that you live in. Related to this is a claim about historical relativism. It's a slight variation on that. It says that right and wrong depends on what the mores, or the moral views, of a particular historical period are. So, what people thought was right in the 18th century, we now see is wrong, or vice versa. Okay, so to use an example, an obvious example from American history, over 150 years ago, slavery was legal in the United States and was even praised by some people as positively good, whereas today, you can hardly find anyone who would deny that it's gravely wrong. And thanks be to God for that. It is gravely wrong. But that's obviously a very big change. So a phenomenon like that is posited as evidence that there are no claims to moral rightness or wrongness that transcend a given historical period. Okay, another form of relativism you can find in law schools. It's called legal positivism. It holds that right and wrong depends on what the positive law says. So when lawmakers make a law saying that X is forbidden, then it becomes morally wrong to do it. And if the lawmakers change that law, then it becomes morally right to do it. Not all forms of legal positivism are quite as strongly relativistic as that, but some forms of it tend in that direction. So all of these views assert that there is no unchanging, non-arbitrary standard of right and wrong, and that all moral claims are relative to culture or historical context or language or legal regime, etc. So can we make any kind of answer to this kind of claim about relativism? So let me give you 4 quick replies to the claims of moral relativism. So these are like 4 reasons why moral relativism doesn't work. So the first, the fatal flaw of all forms of relativism is that they contain an internal contradiction. They assert that the proposition that there are no truths that hold always and everywhere is a truth that holds always and everywhere. So that's what philosophers call a problem of self-reference. So you cannot apply that claim to itself. It's self-contradictory, and in fact, it's incoherent. So technically speaking, it's like a meaningless claim because it negates itself. And all forms of relativism really have this hiding in them somewhere, if you look hard enough. Okay, the second answer. While there might be some superficial evidence that seems to support, say, cultural or historical relativism, for example, that there have been disagreements across cultures or historical periods about some particular moral questions, like slavery or polygamy or homosexuality or something like that, okay? You can identify places where those acts may have been judged differently. The relativist argument ignores the much broader and deeper agreement about moral principles that you find really across many, I think you could say all times and all cultures. Okay, third argument. Why should the fact that some people, or even some cultures, have made excuses for things that are gravely wrong, why should that lead us to conclude that there are no such thing as morally wrong things? Okay, so the relativist argument can sometimes go like, well, that guy over there said that it wasn't wrong for him to have slaves. Why should we then conclude that it isn't wrong to have slaves? Or that there is no actual truth of the matter about that? And that's in a way what the relativist argument is trying to do, just on a broader context, using historical periods or cultural contexts. In addition, we should not conflate the moral status of social or cultural conventions, for example, In some cultures, belching at the table is very rude, but in other cultures, belching at the table is a necessary part of etiquette, right? Okay, that's obviously culturally conditioned and depends on cultural circumstance. But we shouldn't confuse those kinds of judgments about right and wrong. You know, it's right to belch at the table, it's wrong to belch at the table, with deeper moral principles like to directly and intentionally kill an innocent person is wrong. Okay, these are not the same kinds of judgments. One is more easily identifiable, it's kind of obviously identifiable, as a convention of a particular context, like a particular polite society, while the other is a moral truth that applies always and everywhere. In fact, the relativist argument deliberately obscures distinctions between these two kinds of judgments in order to claim that some moral censures from the past were merely conventional, and because we can also find some examples of socially sanctioned wrongdoing, therefore there are no enduring moral principles. So you kind of put those two things together and you get the relativist argument. All right, fourth theoretical argument against moral relativism. And we're coming towards the end here. The relativist needs to be able to claim that not only is one sometimes determined by your historical period or your culture, but that one is always determined by your historical period or culture. Because according to the relativist, all moral claims are historically or culturally conditioned. But that seems to be plainly false. So we see all the time that people challenge moral wrongs in their own culture. And they do so by appealing to universal moral principles. So think, for example, of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King objected to racial segregation, which was legal in the South when he was making the objection. Legal and advocated for by the dominant culture, you might say, the majority culture. And how did he make the argument? He said, this is unjust. And he appealed to the consciences of the majority to recognize that their practice had been deformed by a sinful structure in the culture. And he was right to do that. The fact that that is possible suggests that we are not just determined by our surrounding culture. It's possible to stand over against our culture and make a judgment about it based on universal principles. And that is a kind of proof that moral relativism isn't true. You are not simply conditioned by your surrounding culture. You can be to some degree, but not absolutely. Okay, these are theoretical arguments, but I'd like to add a fifth point about why moral relativism doesn't work. I want to argue that in practice, there are no moral relativists, no true or absolute moral relativists. Even moral relativism itself makes a moral judgment, which it tries very hard to camouflage as something else. But it makes a moral judgment about all the judgmental people out there who believe in absolute moral truths. And I think actually in our time, the camouflage is starting to get pretty thin. Like it becomes more and more evident that by saying don't judge, you are in fact making a judgment, and often a very strong moral judgment. Now that's unsurprising to a Thomist, to a disciple of St. Thomas Aquinas, because according to St. Thomas, moral judgments are judgments about what is good. And there is an unbreakable link between being and goodness. So this is, in a way, the deepest philosophical point that I'm making in the talk. Insofar as something exists, it is good. To be is good. And so our moral judgments are tied to judgments about reality. So, in fact, you cannot escape this And no moral relativist will be able to avoid making moral judgments. We should not be surprised that there are moral judgments hiding behind accusations of being judgmental. Because to make judgments is a part of what it means to be rational. So, in reality, there are no, and there could not really be, practical relativists. We make judgments all the time, including moral judgments, and we make them on principles that transcend culture, history, language, legal system, and so forth. And the only real question is whether we will camouflage these judgments in the rhetoric of relativism, or even to our own self-awareness, like we may not be aware of the degree to which we are being judgmental, or we will bring them out into the open where they can be assessed and discussed. And that's where I think they really need to be in a civil society. Because it's the essence of civil society to be able to discuss openly what is good for our community. What is good for a human person? What is a human person and what leads to human flourishing? So I'd like to conclude with with a quotation from John Paul II. So Pope John Paul II taught about the danger of relativism, the monstrous human cost of it, and he lived this in his own life experience. So he lived in Poland under two infamous totalitarian regimes. He lived under the Nazis and he lived under Soviet communism. And he wrote this about totalitarianism. Totalitarianism arises out of a denial of truth in the objective sense. If there is no transcendent truth, in obedience to which man achieves his full identity, then there is no sure principle for guaranteeing just relations between people. Think about that. He says if there's no objective truth, then you cannot find just relations between people. So he goes on. Their self-interest as a class, a group, or a nation would inevitably set them in opposition to one another. If one does not acknowledge transcendent truth, then the force of power takes over, and each person tends to make full use of the means at his disposal in order to impose his own interests or his own opinion, with no regard for the rights of others. In other words, a crisis of truth leads to a crisis of democracy and ultimately to a crisis of freedom. And I think that's quite prophetic, because in the absence of any objective truth, you can no longer make an argument to persuade another. You can only make an appeal to power. That's his claim. So to safeguard the integrity of our judgment of the truth is actually also to safeguard the possibility of a free democratic society. And that is why Pope Benedict XVI later spoke about what he called a dictatorship of relativism. So in the end, if you adopt relativism, you will be forced into a dynamic that is not governed by reason. And without rational discourse, there can only be appeals to ideology or to political power, but not appeals to the truth. There will still be judgments there, because that's inevitable, but they will not be subjected to rational analysis, but they will be imposed by acts of will or by acts of power. And I would suggest to you that that kind of dynamic is inimical to the nature of the university itself. The university does not exist to serve an ideology or to serve power. It exists for the sake of pursuing knowledge of the reality around us, knowledge of the truth. And that is what the human mind is made for, to know the truth. And from that truth, freedom springs. As our Lord says, you shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Father Dominic, for that talk. At risk of judging rashly, your excellent talk.
You may need your microphone there for the
Yeah,
people
so
at
we
home.
are having some audio difficulties.
Okay, got it.
As we transition into our brief Q&A, if you could just restate the question along with it, so
Sure.
listeners
Yeah.
at home could get it. So I'll open it up at first to our in-person guest, Alex.
Yeah, please.
Thank you very much for coming. My question is, after, let's just say that we accept objective reality, there still is a bit more of a, you could say, relativistic minor discussions, or seemingly relativistic discussions. So we can acknowledge that there is an objective morality for justice, whatever it may platonically be. But within virtually any group of two or more people, like the Catholic Church is no exception, there still will be different discussions on what does that actually mean. With environmental policy, it doesn't matter if you're from the same political party. There still will be dissenting opinions within themselves over what is the most just environmental
That's right.
policy. So my question is, even if we agree that there is a right and wrong with a policy or rule or whatnot, then how do we articulate it on a more specific and tangible way?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. So just to repeat for everybody at home, the question, to summarize, is people are going to disagree about some of the concrete judgments, like even if we're just talking about environmental regulations, you're going to disagree about whether this particular regulation is a good idea or not. And more broadly, of course, on other subjects, people are really going to disagree. You would even find some of that disagreement perhaps within the Catholic Church, where people will make just different assessments. So given that, how can we, well, am I getting your question? Given that disagreement, how then can we talk about there being a kind of objective moral order? Is that? Yeah. Even if we agree that there is an objective truth in general, like in this particular case. Okay, so that's an excellent question, a classic one. So I think the answer would go something like this, just to be very brief. First of all, it's very important to acknowledge that there is an objective order of truth. Okay, so if we don't acknowledge that, we will have all the problems that I was just identifying. Okay, so if you grant that and you say, okay, but all we have really are kind of very highfalutin, high-level principles that we can agree on, but then when we get down to the details, we have lots of disagreements. And that's, like, just factually speaking, that seems to be validated by our experience. We do see that happen. And how would Aquinas analyze that? He would say, well, that speaking, for example, of the natural law. So Aquinas has an account of the natural law. He thinks that there are certain general principles that every human being has access to by power of the light of natural reason, and reflecting on their some very, very simple experience. So, for example, the first principle, which he thinks is what he calls per se nota, is a self-evident principle, is that good is to be sought and evil is to be avoided. Okay, everyone basically is going to be able to agree. If you put it that generically, like, we will have universal agreement. But then when you try to make it more specific, like, what is the good to be sought today? That's much harder to answer, and you're going to have more difficulty getting agreement. Okay, so as you descend into particulars, the moral truth of the matter is harder to discern, and it's more subject to real disagreement. That's why it's important for us to have, like, a political process. The political process is there in Aquinas' view, like, it serves a positive function. Politics is not just a bad word. Politics is the way we together deliberate about the common good for our community. So our community is going to need to make decisions. I mean, if we just had this group of people together and we're like, okay, we want to order some takeout for dinner. What are we going to order? Are we going to order pizza? Are we going to order Thai food? Are we going to order Chinese? Are we going to get subs or wings or what? You know, like, we could have a discussion about that, and there will be different opinions about what the good for tonight would be. And I might be like, hey, guys, we're going to have pizza tomorrow. We definitely don't want to order pizza 2 nights in a row, so let's not get the pizza 2 nights in a row, you know? And, Nick is like, oh, but Father, you don't know how good the pizza is. Like, maybe it's okay. We're going to have real disagreements about this. And this is on the level of a very, very particular, low-level moral good, But we do need to make a judgment about what we're going to do. And we need to have some mechanism for doing that. That isn't just, especially when we're talking about the real common good of the community, which isn't just pizza, but like how do we together pursue the truth? How do we together pursue justice? And those kinds of things require some common judgment and should not be imposed by just an arbitrary imposition of power or ideology. But it doesn't mean that we're going to have universal agreement. So Aquinas certainly thinks that, especially with respect to the goods to be pursued, we will have a harder time laying those out, and that it's easier to see clearly the evils that you must not do. So the tradition has a kind of divided account of negative precepts, thou shalt not, versus positive precepts, which is you must do X. Okay, so to use a very simple example, if you were to try and follow the teachings of Jesus, he would say, thou shalt not commit adultery. Okay, so adultery is taken off the table. And then he says, love your neighbor. Okay, what can we conclude about that? Thou shalt not commit adultery is what's called a negative precept. It obtains always and everywhere. That means there's never an act of adultery that you could justify by some other consideration. Like, well, I committed the act of adultery because I really wanted a vacation in the Bahamas, and so that justified it. No, Aquinas would say there's never a sufficient justification for that act. On the other side, though, are you bound? So you're bound to never commit adultery. Are you bound to always do what is the best possible thing for your neighbor? Well, no, actually, in fact, you're bound to generically will the good of your neighbor, but for any individual act of beneficence towards your neighbor, you will have to make a judgment about the circumstances. You're not obliged to give all of your money away to your neighbors, for example. So it's harder to make a judgment about particulars, especially with respect to the positive good to be achieved, than it is with respect to the things our community should never do. So for Aquinas, he would say, well, it should be easy, in principle, for the community to agree that we have to outlaw murder. Murder is always wrong, so that's like a baseline moral condition for civil society. But we don't necessarily have to say that you have to, be constantly bringing dinner to your neighbor. That might be a good thing to do, but it might not be what the state should legislate for you to do. So he would include, for example, abortion in that judgment. Like abortion involves the direct killing of an innocent human being, and therefore should never be permitted. Obviously, that's deeply controverted in our time. I think that's not a sign of our moral maturity. I think it's a sign that we're having a little bit of a problem there.
I just want to say thank you for coming out. I really enjoyed this. I'm just going to throw a curveball because it's fun.
Yeah.
But so no one's a moral relativist, like you said, right? No one behaves like it. No one can actually tentatively work like that. Everyone has a good in their life. Everyone has an aim. And they do things to get towards it. So everyone has rational preferences, right? Wouldn't it be fair to say that a relativist framework is simply what we use to evaluate value judgments, to separate value judgments that are created from the specificity of the time or culture, like slavery or the innateness of racial hierarchy, from the transcendent formal truths, right? A relativist framework is what you use to separate those things.
Yeah.
And that's why you need it in a place like university. Not because there is no objective truth, but because you need a framework to distinguish those formal truths from the culturally specific truths.
Yeah. So there's a couple different versions, classical versions. That's an excellent question, first of all, and a really good one. And there are several classical ways to talk about that. So one way to talk about it would be what social science would posit, like a distinction between facts and values, right? So you can have factual statements, which science is capable of adjudicating, and then you have value judgments, which are not in the realm of objective, verifiable, say, scientific appraisal, and therefore those things have a different status, And we might admit that some of them are real or true, but we might say, but the university is not really competent to adjudicate them, or our common political system is not fit to adjudicate them, and therefore we should bracket those off and set them aside. Another version of that argument is a kind of classical Enlightenment argument for liberal political order. And this is actually kind of liberal, not in the sense of contemporary American politics, conservative and liberal, but liberal in the sense of classical liberal. And it goes something like this, that, we have such deep disagreements about what is really good, and you saw this, say, in Europe in the wars of religion, that therefore we should take that whole category of questions and bracket it off and say, politics should not look at those things. And we should really just identify the bad things that we want to avoid and be agnostic about these higher questions about higher truths. So let's just pick the baseline things that we can all agree on, and we'll use that as the basis for our kind of common political system. And then these higher things we can't all agree on, so we're just going to bracket those off and leave them for the private sphere. Well, there's a problem. I'll start with that second point. There's a problem with that, which is that it's in the end not really possible to define what is bad without reference to what is good, because in fact these are fundamentally related issues. And so in determining what you think is bad, you are making judgments about what is good. And you're camouflaging it in a certain way. That was one of the main points of my talk, that you cannot really separate these things. So you will be camouflaging the judgments you are making about those other issues without acknowledging that, in fact, that may be what you're doing. So it requires a little work to maybe see how that works. But I mean, I think it would be like this in the abortion debate, for example, where you say, all right, well, we don't have agreement on this. So we just have to take that question off the table. We just have to accept that we're going to disagree. And therefore, we should have no laws that forbid abortion because we don't have universal agreement about it, or sufficient agreement about it. But the problem is that then effectively, certainly from a traditional view that killing an innocent person is wrong, the society has now made a radically unjust decision. So it's not neutral. It's not a neutral decision. It's actually a very bad decision. Second point about facts and values. That was related to the whole first part of the talk, where I was trying to show. Now this is a very deep argument. We could spend a lot of time in philosophy going through it. But the what's classically called the convertibility of being and goodness. That is, that something insofar as it is good. And so there isn't a radical divide between factual judgments and judgments about what is good. So the Thomist claim in the end is that you can try to separate those things out, but that is not really going to work in the end, because hiding in the factual judgments will be judgments about what is good. So it's like we should limit carbon emissions. Carbon emissions cause low air quality. Low air quality, is something that our community should pursue. Therefore, we should limit carbon emissions. There is an implicit moral claim in there about what is good for the human community, what is good about air quality. There's a lot more to your question, so I regret that we could probably go on that for a long time. But it's an excellent question.
Thank you. Just another one kind of in reference to continue our conversation about liberalism, maybe nuance it a little bit. So in what sense of, this is coming from Dr. Daniel Klein in the online audience, in what sense of liberalism, if any, is compatible with Thomism?
Okay, wow. So to repeat the question, this is from Dr. Daniel Klein, and it's in what sense is there any sense in which a system of liberalism is compatible with Thomism? So that's a very big and potentially touchy question. because we live in a liberal regime, right? And so there's been a kind of, you can find some people who claim that Thomists are necessarily anti-liberal or have, have to be monarchists, and therefore, we have to get, and there are, this is in some places a very live debate today, where you have people who will say, you know what, we need an honest appraisal of the political system that we've inherited, and we have to honestly admit that it is really like something has gone very wrong with it, and specifically with respect to liberalism. So liberalism is the problem, and the solution is we have to ditch liberalism, and we have to go back to what is sometimes described as there are various more and less plausible versions of the alternative view. But sometimes it would be described under the heading of integralism, like we need to have a system that maybe recognizes an explicit embrace of religion, of Christianity, and says these are moral truths and the political community needs to act towards them. Or we should not just subject the judgment of moral questions to popular voting in a democracy. So actually there needs to be perhaps some other system, a system that's monarchical or aristocratic or something like that. So there are certainly people who have viewed Thomists as necessarily being committed to that view. I would be a little more cautious before saying that like you have to go to that. And actually I gave a talk at a Thomistic Institute conference a few years ago on precisely this subject, which was later published as an article, so I'll refer anyone who wants to read that. It's called, Do Thomists Have Rights? Because rights are one of the classical features of a kind of liberal regime that has like a democratic process, safeguarding individual rights by means, for example, of a Bill of Rights like we have. And there has been an argument coming from people who are sharp critics of contemporary liberalism. Some names that you may have heard: Patrick Deneen makes an argument like this. Rod Dreher makes similar sorts of critiques. There's a theologian here in Washington, D.C. named Michael Hanby who has said some things that are sort of similar to that. So you could make that kind of critique from a, like you might say, a strongly religious or traditional Catholic, traditional religious, traditional Christian perspective. I, in that article, tried to show that Thomists actually do have, deeply embedded in Aquinas himself, an understanding of how to think about rights, but not rights as like radically individual, like rights as radical or absolute claims based on individual autonomy, but rather as embedded in a larger understanding of the political order as ordered to the common good. So I don't think there's anything in the thought of Aquinas himself that would not allow you to come up with an articulation of a political system where you have a kind of democratic form of government that is ordered towards a conception of the common good, and that protects individual rights as a feature of that ordering towards the common good. In other words, something that looks like our system. Although I would admit that there are some things about our system that I think need adjustment, that need moral correction, and but I don't think that's an impossible. That's not like squaring a circle.
Thank you. We'll go with just one last question, a little more practical. Matthew Gosson in the online audience asks, brass tacks, how would you relay this to a person struggling with moral relativism? For someone who is stuck, unable to accept what is extremely painful and difficult within their own sinful life, is how he describes it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this can be very existential and concrete for people, moral questions. And I think that one of the things that I mentioned earlier in the talk was often when you talk about like law and morality, the first place many people in our culture, the first place their mind goes is they imagine you've got like maybe an evangelical preacher with a Bible and he's thumping you over the head with the Bible telling you about sexual morality. and people don't want that. So they think that morality is basically about a bunch of commandments that are going to make you miserable or make you feel miserable or make you feel like you're a bad person or you're irredeemable or you're a sinner and, like you're never going to make it out, that kind of thing. And this is not the classical Thomistic understanding of what morality is all about. Morality is about achieving your good, which is what will make you happy. So that a moral inquiry is a moral inquiry about what will lead you to your flourishing. Now, it's, to go back to the question, someone may have a situation in his or her own life or in the life of someone that they love that makes it, like someone I care about deeply is doing something that maybe the Christian tradition would say is wrong. And then how do I deal with that? How can I remain friends with that person? And I think some of the distinctions that I was pointing out in the talk are very important here. You can continue to acknowledge the truth of the situation, so the objective nature of the act, while continuing to love the person. The classic way to speak about this is to say you love the sinner, but hate the sin. And so I think that's very important to kind of free even people maybe who have a very strong Catholic or Christian worldview, very strong system of beliefs. People like that may feel like they're maybe doing something wrong by judging other people. And so that it can be very liberating to recognize, okay, I'm not supposed to be judging the heart of this person. I can love them, I seek their good, I try to be nice to them. That doesn't mean that I praise them for this action, or that I don't keep, at least in the back of my mind, and perhaps at some point in the way that we interact, the correct judgment about the objective action. But that doesn't have to ruin my personal relationship with the person. And I think it's very important to be, to be loving, to be compassionate, to be merciful. That's something that our culture does not understand, is to be merciful. And mercy is a wonderful remedy. And it's one thing for us to, for me to say, oh, I'm a sinner, I need God's mercy, I'm going to go to confession, I'm going to ask for that mercy. That's very important, of course, fundamentally important. But it's also very important for me to seek mercy from other people, to go to them and apologize, and to be merciful to others, even maybe before they apologize. And that can be very, very powerful. It's a great act of love to be merciful to another person. It does not mean that I say, oh, what you did was not wrong. But it's a way of saying, I love you even though what you did is wrong. I still love you. And so here's the point that I would conclude with. It's a point about God, and a very important point about God, that it's a way that we should strive to imitate God, which is part of what it means to be a Christian. God does not love us because we are good. He loves us because He is good. So, in fact, of ourselves, we are not good compared to God. He makes us good by the gift first of being itself, which we didn't deserve, and by then the gift of His grace, which really does make us genuinely good. So God shares His love with us, and that is the source of our becoming good. So this is a very profound truth. There's nothing in me that makes God love me. Like, I do not call forth God's love. Actually, His love is the cause of me being at all. His love is absolutely first. And that means that the reason for God loving me is not so much in me as it is in God. So maybe that sounds very abstract, but it cashes out in a very, very concrete way, which is no matter how bad my actions are, nothing I do will stop God loving me, because his love of me is not based on my actions. His loving me is based on his goodness and his desire to share that goodness with me. So his love is actually what makes me better. And so for us, like to have this attitude that, we want to share that love of God, which we have received, with other people. And that means being merciful and loving to them, even when they don't deserve it. And in fact, the truth is, none of us deserve it in the end. But God gives it to us anyway. And that's the wonderful gift of his mercy.
Well, thank you, Father Dominic.
Thank you. Do you want to use this to make any concluding remarks, or are we done? Okay. Thanks, everybody, for watching from home.